Our theme for the home stretch of ordinary time, or the great green growing season, is peace with creation. As I hope you have heard, this theme draws inspiration from Pope Francis's 2015 encyclical on care for our common home, also known as the Laudato Si, and has brought together an ecumenical group of Christians who now observe a season of creation in September and October. We're doing October and November. The theme text of this season is where we'll start today, Isaiah 32, 14 to 18. But first, what exactly do we mean by peace? It is important to remember that it is not only the absence of conflict, but seeking the shalom, the well-being and the flourishing of all of creation, of which human beings are just one part of many. I often experience this kind of mutual flourishing in my garden, of course. Some of you will have seen the pictures of my aphid-infested pole beans, which I have resisted pulling out because I noticed that they were also covered in ladybugs and their larvae. That's the ecosystem at work. Or you might have heard me talk affectionately about wasps and how I've seen them hunting for the cabbage moth caterpillars that devour my kale. But let me reassure you that there are still unredeemed parts of me, like when I find a giant cockroach in the shower and call for fire to rain down from the heavens and annihilate my enemies. It's clear that when it comes to the flourishing of insects, there remains a tension within me as to which ones are good and which ones are bad. Likewise, in her book, Rooted Faith: Practices for Living Well on a Fragile Planet, Sarah Werner names 2 tension points for all of us as we strive to live well on our fragile planet. The first one is that living well means living in direct opposition to our modern consumer culture. Number 2, living well means acknowledging that the world is full of both beauty and tragedy. We encounter both of these tensions in the text of Isaiah 32, 14 to 18. Isaiah the prophet began his work in the southern kingdom of Judah during the 8th century BCE. You've heard me talk about this time period on several occasions this past summer. The first half of the 8th century BCE was a time of imperial expansion and growing economic disparity between the wealthy and the poor. We're not talking about just well-off people here, but those who led indolent and indulgent lives at the gross expense of the poor, all the while behaving smugly pious. It happened like this. The ruling class would be able to levy heavy taxes on subsistence farmers. When they couldn't pay, their land was pledged as collateral for loans, and this drove them further into debt, resulting in loss of their ancestral lands and leaving them to work as indentured servants on their own land. Large landowners were able to then convert the subsistence farms with their diversity of crops, the ones that actually feed people, into one of the cash crops for export: grain, wine, or oil. Now, it's always hard to pick up in the middle of a passage, right in the middle of the action. And in the case of our text for today, which begins with verse 14, that's exactly what's happening. Even worse, it begins with the word for. For is a word that is used to indicate purpose or result. In other words, verse 14 could be understood as saying, the result is that the palace will be deserted, the crowded city abandoned, stronghold and watchtower will become empty fields forever, suited for the pleasure of wild donkeys and a pasture for flocks. Okay, the result of what? Well, we have to go back at least to the beginning of the chapter. Our text is in the middle of chapter 32 that itself is disrupting a whole series of woes, and woes aren't good. This chapter is actually announcing good news that God will bring about radical newness. Verses 1 through 8 are a vision of restoration, of things being set right in society. But not everyone welcomes this kind of good news. As Walter Brueggemann says, those who cling to the old ways of satiation and indulgence do not welcome the newness. The section beginning in verse 9 is addressed to women who are at ease, who are instructed to lament. They are instructed to lament, for the vintage will fail, the fruit harvest will not come. They are instructed to lament for the pleasant fields, for the fruitful vine, for the soil of my people growing up in thorns and briars. So the crops fail, and the palace is deserted, the city abandoned, stronghold and watchtower become empty fields. This is more than just a bad year with no rain. In Empires of Food, Feast, Famine, and the Rise and Fall of Civilizations by Evan D.G. Fraser and Andrew Remus, civilizations are shown to rise and fall with their agricultural production. Cash cropping, as we've seen with the production of grain, wine, and oil in the 8th century BCE, overtaxes the land to the point of collapse. That's what the 4 is for, the result. But when the winds of renewal come, there is transformation with the word until. The desolation of verse 14 remains until a spirit from on high is poured out upon us. Ruach is a powerful Hebrew word that can mean wind, spirit, or breath, and it brings transformation to the land. The desert turns into farmland, and the farmland is considered a forest. Now, the third movement of our text is signaled with the word then. We've had resulting devastation. We've had transformation, and now the resolution. Then justice will reside in wild lands, and righteousness will abide in farmlands. The fruit of righteousness will be peace, and the outcome of righteousness, calm and security forever. Then my people will live in a peaceful dwelling, in secure homes, in carefree resting places. When there is justice for the land, the result is peace. There is calm and security without the military strongholds and watchtowers. There are peaceful dwellings without the opulence of palaces. If peace with creation is our goal, how do we restore broken relationships with creation? Of course, there's not just one answer, but many. We've mentioned that this series will draw from Sarah Werner's book, Rooted Faith. So next week, Michael Coons will preach on the theme, Creation is Alive, which will cover chapters 1 and 3. We're also hiking at the Mackenzie Preserve with Kevin and Zrempel this coming Saturday, so let me know if you want to come. Then Brian will preach on the theme of lament in chapter 4. We'll pause the series for All Saints' Day and then pick it back up again when I preach on Sabbath and reconnecting with the holy, touching on chapters 5 and 6. And we'll then conclude the series on November 16th when Sarah Werner herself will preach on the theme of a new heaven and a new earth, climate justice and restoring creation. And then, as if someone planned it this way, that same evening, November 16th, the San Joaquin River Parkway will come here to share concerns about the proposed CEMEX mining expansion along the river. So if you haven't seen it, there's a half-sheet flyer with all of that information. And if you're reading along with us in the Rooted Faith book, you'll also note that there are suggested practices at the end of each chapter, except for today, which serves as the introduction to the series. When I think about the 8th century BCE, one of the strongest elements of commonality that I see between then and now is an extractive mindset that looks at creation and only considers it valuable if it is profitable. This past week, I rewatched the 3 lectures from the Living Faithfully in Our Watershed series last fall. Did you know that they're posted on our website and on YouTube? And as I was rewatching the second lecture by Rachel Friesen, entitled Ecological Issues in Our Watershed, it occurred to me that maybe our practice for this week is to observe our language when we talk about creation. Rachel says, through this talk, I want us to kind of reimagine who is our neighbor, who is kin, and who is relative. I think the language of it has allowed the extractive ideas. If a river is an it, we can totally abuse it. We can take all of the water for our own needs without giving anything back. But if a river is more than it, if a river has a right to exist, then we have a different relationship with the river and all the life that is contained within the river. I don't think it's any coincidence that Pope Francis, whose work sparked the annual celebration of the season of creation, took his name from St. Francis, who wrote the Canticle of Creatures, in which he makes reference to brother sun, sister moon, brother wind, sister water, and sister Mother Earth. That's St. Francis and the Narthex, by the way. So this is our practice this week, to observe our own language about our fellow creatures, like the ladybugs and the wasps, my co-workers in the garden, or the cockroach, my mortal enemy. How are we formed and transformed by the language that we use? May we attend well to our words during this season of creation, that we may seek the peace and flourishing of all. May it be so. Amen.